Welcome to game 4 of the World Championship. So far, the first three games have all been drawn, so the scoreline is tied 1.5 points each. This was the fourth game with Magnus playing on the white side. Now, in the first game that he was white in game 2, Magnus played d4 and played the Catalan. This time he switched it up and started with e4 instead. He did something similar in one of the previous World Championship matches against Vichy, I think, where as white didn't have just one move. In general, in World Championship matches, people prepare one opening, but he started a few games with d4, a few games with e4, a few games with even c4, just trying to hit at every sort of part of Vichy's prep, and maybe he's doing something similar in this match. So this game started with e4 to see what Nepo has prepared here. And Nepo responded with e5, knight f3, and here Nepo, through the first surprise, he played knight f6, playing into the Petroff. Now, Nepo has never played the Petroff before, and so this must have been at least a little bit of a surprise to Magnus. After the game, he intimated in an interview that he wasn't really surprised, but it had to be at least a bit of a surprise because this was really the first time he had played Petroff. It probably wasn't too much of a surprise because one of those super solid openings that people will tend to when they want to play a safe game. And in general, in these World Championship matches as black, people tend not to prepare very risky or sharp things because you want to hold with black and then try and push with white. So probably this or the Berlin is probably what he thought Nepo would have gone for, but Nepo played the Petrov. Now the reason why that is bad news for us is because it's super solid. It means Nepo's match strategy is not to try and risk all that much. Going into the match, there was a lot of talk about how much of a wild kind of player Nepo can be, the way he likes tactical open positions, and that's meant the match could be a bit exciting. But that also was kind of his Achilles heel because it means more often than not he'll get himself into positions where he plays with a lot of risk, and especially against someone like Magnus, that could really backfire. So it seems like his strategy for the match was to try and prove just how solid he can be. Because in previous matches, especially against Sergey, they really proved that Magnus can be a bit troubled if you play super solid chess because he needs to win. So if you just go like this, you defend and he can't break through, then he has to try and play risky kind of chess to try and win, and that's kind of in backfire on him. So when you can't beat him, you kind of make him beat himself by trying over pressing, and that may be his match strategy going into this one. And I mean, you can't fault the guy because I mean Magnus really is just a better player. So how was I supposed to beat him than to make him beat himself? So they played the Petrov. And maybe because Magnus wasn't expecting it or for some other reason, in this game, he didn't play what he usually did in the first three games where he goes for some rare sideline trying to get a game. But he just played the main line, like the proper main line of pretty much the entire Petrov. Knight takes e5, d6, knight f3, and then knight takes e4. This is really where you can start to branch. And if you really want like a game, the super topical thing that you can play that leads to kind of interesting positions is knight c3. But Magnus went for d4, and in d4 it's a bit easier for black to equalize. So Nepo went d5, bishop d3, bishop d6. You can see the position is quite symmetrical. Many times this knight will jump back even and you have a proper symmetry. Castles, c4 to try and break the symmetry, attack this pawn. The pawn can't take note because the knight will be hanging. So c4, black defended with c6, and this is really the only imbalance in the c pawn. So white has a little bit more space, but in practice, it's been proven that it's usually not enough to prove any sort of advantage. But anyways, Magnus will try rook e1. All of this is the very main line. Bishop f5 to defend that point. The queen came to b3 to put some pressure on this pawn as well as here on the b7. But queen d7 holds both points quite nicely. And then knight c3. So now white is breaking through here on the d5 square. 1, 2, 3 attackers and only 1, 2 defenders. The queen also kind of defends because bishop h2 is always possible. So now black has to do something, has to give. So usually what he does is that he takes on c3. And here as white, you can't just take back the knight because you land yourself in a slightly uncomfortable position after bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, and then he's going to take here and force you into an isolated queen's pawn's position. And it can be good. It's balanced, but this is not a good version of it for white because you don't have a ton of pieces. Your compensation for this pawn is to try and get active pieces and get some sort of attack with these outposts and these files, but I just have 2 pieces left, and they're not really great at attacking black skin here. So this would be more of a weakness than a strength, this isolated queen's pawn. So usually after knight takes c3 here, the main line, which is what Magnus played, is to take the bishop first on f5, and then the queen takes back. And this is where, again, if you really want to complicate the game, you can make things a bit more interesting. You can just take back the knight. but then you realize that the b7 point is also a bit sore, so you can also take on b7. And here the main line continues queen d7 when the queen comes back, and you take the knight, but that could land you in a bit of trouble after you take the rook, sorry, because you realize that your queen is actually now just almost trapped, and like something like knight a6 at the right time would give you a lot of issues. So I mean, first you have to save this knight, of course. So after like a knight e4, a knight a4 even, you can try and get this knight out of it and argue that this white queen is trapped. So that's a bit dangerous. But after queen d7, you can also just take the queen, and then after knight takes, you can take this guy back, and you are sort of up a pawn, and you get the pawn back. Black has to take this one. And you can play this endgame and argue that these guys are a bit weak, but in general, again, it's been proven in practice to be quite equal. But Magnus decided not to go this route, and after queen takes f5, he just took back the knight on c3. So Nepo played b6, the pawn took on d5, pawn took on d5, queen b5. And this is all still theory, by the way. 38 games have been played from this point on. The queen dropped back to d7. Here Magnus opted for a4. A number of moves have been played here, including b1. That was maybe the most popular one. But a4 too has been played 10 times. And after a4, queen takes b5, a takes b5. Nepo only needed to know this little finesse with a5, because in this position, the pawn on b5 kind of clamps down on these two pawns and makes the pawn on a7 a bit backward and weak. And if you're not aware of this idea of breaking free, that may be a weakness in some endgame. But Nepo knew exactly what he was doing, played a5 immediately, and the pawn is kind of out of trouble. You can take, but it doesn't really lead to anything after the knight takes, but you're going to trade pieces. And the weakness on c3 counterbalances this one on b6, so the position is just very balanced. So Magnus here opted for something different. B takes a6 is what has been played in all the games that have reached this position. So this is where he played the first rule novelty. He opted for h4, a very interesting idea. The knight on f3 looks okay. I mean, it's looking into here, just looking into here, but it's not really doing anything super productive. And the idea behind knight h4 is to reroute the knight. First of all, if you allow me, I'm going to come and sit here on f5 and have a very nice squares under my control. But in general, we don't expect black to allow this, so Nepo did play g6, of course. And then Magnus's idea was to continue with g4, gaining some space on the king side, but more importantly, freeing this g2 square for the knight, because the knight wants to use this square as a sort of pivot point to come into one of these two squares on e3 or f4. Because in this position, the real weakness I want to attack for black is this pawn. So you need to put the knight on the square where it attacks this pawn, and either of these two squares does that job. So the whole idea of knight h4, g4 was to try and open up this idea for white. So Nepo continued with knight d7. So Magnus played knight g2 as planned. Then Nepo's rook came to the c file to attack Magnus's weakness here on c3. Magnus played bishop f4. Here passive defense doesn't really work. If you try something like bishop d2 as white, you might actually run into a bit of trouble. And the problem is because black now actually has a passed pawn. So if you hold down the king side and center without getting any kind of counterplay, he's just going to start pushing this pawn, and he may be in trouble at some point. So like a knight f6, the knight now attacks, this pawn threatens to come here. You have to play f3, and then the rook can start challenging you on the e file, because if you trade rooks, again, this passed pawn will be a big problem for you. So you have to go for active counterplay. So bishop f4, exchanging bishops, and then your knight is going to come onto this square and attack this guy, and that's where your counterplay will come from. So bishop f4, knight f4, rook takes on c3, knight takes on d5, rook d3. Now his rook invades into d7, but the knight comes to f8 and everything is just solid. So knight f6, king g7, and if this were a normal GM game, they'll probably repeat just here with knight e8, king g8, knight f6. The next move was knight g8, king g8. But Magnus being Magnus, he couldn't just go for a repetition. He had to try and complicate the position a little, because at this point, neither player had spent more than 30 minutes thinking. Like, they got here really, really fast, and the position is just completely dead. But Magnus tried to complicate a little, maybe just try and get some play going. He played d5. The idea being that if you take, of course, you get fogged with knight f6, so you can't take. So he threatens to kind of push his pawn. But then Nepo also has a pass pawn of his own, and so it's going to play a4, a3, a2 if you want to push your pawn. And it's still completely level. So knight f6, king g7, and he tried g5 to now cement the knight in here, and then try and push this pawn some more, because now the knight protects this square on d7, so he can make progress. Nepo pushes pawn with a3. Magnus here opted to go for the repetition, but he could have tried. Here he repeated one, knight e8, king g8, knight f6, king g7, and he repeated the third time to get a draw. But he could have tried pushing his pawn some further with d6. But now the knight would come to e6, maybe you can push d7. Of course, after e6, the rook still cannot take because of 98 check. So after knight e6, d7, the point was that Nepo could just play something simple like rook d8. Knight g5 also actually works, but it's not even necessary. Something like rook d8 is very simple, and you're never going to queen. I mean, there's no way to make any kind of progress. So after the game, they were discussing a few lines down this variation. After something like rook e8, you're still not flirting anything because when you take the knight, will just take back, and you still have no way of actually queening. And so black will play something like h6, and then you try and cement this pawn in, but then yeah, there's no way for white to make any progress. So in this position, Magnus decided not to tempt things. He thought for a long time, like more than 30 minutes. And yeah, he didn't really find anything. So he just continued with the repetition. And after king g8, knight f6, they had a draw by threefold repetition. So yeah, once again, the second day in a row where we've had a very straightforward and, to be frank, quite a boring draw today. It wasn't like super boring, but yeah, nothing really interesting happened. It never actually left the main line, and Nepo probably didn't have to calculate a single move by himself. The entire game pretty much followed mainline theory, so it wasn't super interesting. After the game, Magnus commented in the press conference that yeah, you don't always expect to surprise your opponents. So the reason why he played the very main line is because you have to get a position where you can surprise them in, right? And not knowing beforehand, especially that Nepo was going to play the Petroff, it would be very difficult for him to have prepared something obscure in one of the sidelines. And because Nepo knows he's playing the Petroff, he would probably have looked at these things just yesterday, right? And maybe the last time Magnus looked at this has been a week or so ago. So it's not wise to even go into complications like that. So at least now that he has the information that Nepo plays the Petroff, if he's about to play e4 again, you can be sure that he'll play something a bit more interesting. At the end of the day, probably more of a victory for Nepo than for Magnus. His preparation was super solid, and again, he didn't miss a beat. What I fear though is what it means for the match situation as regards Nepo's approach, because this means he's again not looking to do anything wild or crazy. He's just going to hold down all the positions as much as possible. And it is proven that when you do this to Magnus, he can tend to overpress because he really doesn't need to win. Like, I think a few days ago, he was asked a question about what he would like to be remembered by 50 years from now. He made a joke that he'd like to be known as someone who won a classical game in the World Championship after 2014. Because since then, he hasn't actually ever won a classical game. He's only won on Rapid. So, yeah, he desperately wants to win. Of course, it was a bit of a joke, but it does reflect something serious that he really, really wants to win this match in classical. And so he might be willing to risk a little, to try and get that win. So Nepo, by being so super solid, is kind of egging him on to try and overpress in one of these games. And that's, I think, probably will happen at some point, because I don't think Magnus is going to play 14 games like this, like the last two that we've seen. He's definitely going to have to do something at some point. And that is when we are really going to see whether this game will go Magnus's way or Nepo's way. So, yeah, not the most interesting game, but it does advance the plot of the entire World Championship. And now the battlegrounds have really been drawn. We know exactly what the players are playing for, and we'll see how they'll both continue with that match strategy. So, yeah, thank you very much for tuning in. Happy chessing. Catch you later. As a side note, I should mention that unfortunately I may not be able to bring you recaps like these for the next few days. Have a bit of an engagement, let's just say. So I may see you a few games down the road, but I'll certainly bring you some more recaps before the end of the match. The last few games I certainly will be around to recaps for. See you. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you haven't, leave a comment, drop a like. Happy chessing, and I'll see you later.